rain over East Devon and turned roads into rivers and town centres into makeshift lakes. Worst hit were Ottery, St Mary and the surrounding towns and villages near Exeter and Sidmouth. Kurt Parry reports.
Torrents on tarmac that last night left the residents of Ottery St Mary helpless onlookers. As more and more rivers gradually crumbled under the strain of the phenomenal rainfall, the streets and shops of Ottery also burst their banks. The morning after the night before, and a mopping up operation that could take months.
Went to the back, and that's where it first started. I thought, hello, there's something water coming in the back. So I grabbed a brush and started to try to scrape it out. Within about 10-15 minutes, it was everywhere. And the car was more or less floating out. You had forgotten about that.
As the whole of August average rainfall fell in less than an hour, last night's flood threat became a reality. Emergency services and volunteers gathered at Devon and Cornwall Police Headquarters to help some campers who had to be evacuated. Though other victims stranded further afield had to fend for themselves.
Over a period of 2 hours, I stood there and watched it rise, probably 5 foot at least. And we were just camped over there, and it was very scary.
A night that set some incredible scenes, but brought with it a tidal wave of misery for those caught up in some of the worst floods for 40 years. Kurt Parry for West Country Live.
And to explain why we're getting these weather conditions, we have meteorologist Dan Suri at the Weather Centre. Dan, we've had near drought conditions, then too much rain. I almost expect a plague of locusts. What's going on?
Well, basically, the reason why we've had so much rain in the last few days is that an area of low pressure has become anchored just to the southwest of the UK, and that's fed lots of thunderstorms and pulses of heavy rain across Devon and Cornwall. And that's, as you know, brought with it some local flooding and some very wet weather. And then this has happened 2 or 3 times this summer, this similar sort of situation, and that's been interspersed by weeks of not too bad weather, really.
It seems extraordinary, though, that 3 inches of rain should fall in 45 minutes. Is this unusual?
Well, it's certainly a very heavy dosing of rain, but it's not really that unusual in thunderstorms, because with thunderstorms, you always find pulses of locally heavy rain contained in those thunderstorms, and certainly it's quite normal in summertime that 3 or 4 inches of rain can fall in only a few minutes or a few hours from a thunderstorm deluge.
But can we expect more? We obviously want to avoid the sort of situations we've seen in Eastern Europe and indeed East Devon.
Well, certainly over the next couple of days, the weather shouldn't be as wet as it has been, and there is a slight chance of scattered thunderstorms during the afternoon, both tomorrow and again on Sunday. But I'm afraid that next week looks like turning a lot more unsettled again. And certainly from Monday through to Thursday, it looks as though the conditions around the region will be windier, cloudier, with showers or longer spells of rain. And as a consequence of that, I'm afraid there's a risk, again, of some local flooding occurring.
Is this very much a symptom of global warming? I have to ask that.
Well, we're not really at all sure about that. We haven't really got enough evidence gathered over a long enough period of time to be able to draw any conclusions as to whether or not this has got anything to do with global warming or not.
Thanks very much.
OK.
A 29-year-old Barnstable.
Council workers and hundreds of flood victims have been one of the worst floods there in living memory. More than 300 people have been taken ill. Ottery St Mary's covered in mud and many households have been flooded out. A single thunderstorm brought several inches of rain and devastation to an area between Honiton and Exeter. Ottery was worst affected, and local people are questioning whether a new flood defence scheme could be to blame. Ottery St Mary's sits on the east bank of the River Otter. The river's floodplain is on its west. A new development, including a hospital, has been built on the plain. To protect that, a flood defence scheme was also built, strengthening the river's banks. That worked. The river was contained, but was running very strongly. The problem was a culvert that runs through Ottery and into the river. With the river running so strongly, the Environment Agency are investigating whether that meant the culvert couldn't empty its water into the river. The result, the culvert swelling and then bursting its banks to flood the town. Well, we can now go over live to Ottery St Mary and join our reporter David Silito. David.
Welcome to the Fursbrook, which is the culvert responsible for it all. As you can see, an innocuous-looking river at the moment. But to get an idea of just how dramatic yesterday's events were, have a look here. This wall has just been swept aside by a torrent of water. The gardens have been utterly destroyed. If we look inside, have a look at the washing there. You'll see some mud. That's an indication of how high the water was when it was rushing past. Back outside, well, this shed certainly wasn't at this angle yesterday morning. And it gets worse. We go around here. few neighbours here are still clearing up after it. Good evening. And as you see, the walls have just been snapped apart. And down there is an even more extraordinary sight. But enough of that, because we'll see that in about a minute's time. But before that, we go back to the events of 24 hours ago. 4 inches in less than 3 hours. Ottery St Mary was awash within minutes. Roads were swamped by several feet of water. Streets were turned into rivers. People tried to keep the water at bay, but it was hopeless.
Nothing we could do, so we started coming inside and pulling everything out of the way and chucking it upstairs as quickly as possible. And like now, it must be about a few inches deep now, at least in most places.
Across East Devon, the water continued to rise. There were more than 600 calls to the fire brigade. Water stood 4 foot deep. In the end, all anyone could do was sit and wait for it to subside. For 80-year-old Lillian Williams, it was one of the worst nights she's ever had in a home she was born in. This morning, her family had rallied round.
At 6 o'clock last night when it started. And then, of course, it come right in, and I was brushing out, trying to keep it out, but no good. So, what could you do? I was, you know, just hopeless and helpless.
A thick layer of mud covered Ottery St Mary. Shopkeepers found their stock ruined.
There was kids going down here on the rubber raft. Never seen anything like it.
Others found their cars destroyed. Neighbours witnessed it as the stream burst through, smashing the wall onto it. This morning, it was a write-off.
It's a shame. I mean, it's a lovely little car.
Another car had been washed along the Furze Brook. Getting it out of the tiny gully posed a few problems. Eventually brought back to the road, it was just one of the worst casualties of the night. Others simply had to push their stranded vehicles home. The long cleaning up job continued through the day. Workers waited as their factory was cleared up. Others were wondering as they swept the mud away what had become of their new flood defences. Well, to talk about those flood defences, I'm joined by Jeff Bateman of the Environment Agency. Everyone in Ottery St Mary saw them being opened a couple of years ago. They didn't work, did they?
Well, the problem is we haven't got flood defences on this small brook that runs underneath the town of Ottery. Our flood defences are actually to defend the bottom of the Ottery St Mary from the river Otter itself. And behind us here we had as much rainfall in 2 hours last night that we normally have in the whole of August. It was an extraordinary amount of rain and very, very intense.
Why wasn't anyone told that this was coming? You know, if you're going to get a rainstorm, you've got your radars, haven't you?
Well, the Environment Agency here is to give warnings, and we were giving warnings. We were monitoring the rain on our radar system in the office, and as we were watching it, suddenly a blip came over Ottery, and it was a very intense rainstorm. Over the last few days, people have noticed very, very heavy but very local rainstorms. I'm afraid Ottery St Mary copped it last night.
So this just appeared on the radar almost out of nowhere?
Well, it's quite magical. Fortunately, we actually have some of our flood defence team live in Ottery. We were on site right at the very start of the incident, and we were trying to help in as much as we could.
Well, all this water actually sort of flows out down into the River Otter, where you've got your new flood defences. Yes. Is it a case that there was just nowhere for this water to go? I mean, have you caused all this?
Well, we're starting the investigation now, and certainly the main problem does seem to be this old culvert that became blocked, and then the water popped up out of the brook through Ottery St Mary, flooded houses all the way through Ottery St Mary, and then hit the flood scheme from the wrong side as it was going into the river. That flood scheme certainly seemed to have kept the River Otter out, but we need to look to see exactly what happened to the water when it was running through down the roads on its way to the mill at the bottom of the valley.
There's been an extraordinary amount of devastation. I mean, tons of rubble have been cleared up today. I mean, what are you really going to be able to do about this? I mean, is there something that people just have to live with?
Well, I mean, our concerns obviously are with the people of Ottery St Mary, and certainly those who have been flooded. It's a horrible thing to do, to be flooded. It's a horrible thing to happen to you. What we as the agency will be doing is making absolutely certain that we find out why. And so our survey work started all the way through today. We're going to have people on site tonight. We're actually expecting a few more storms, but not of the intensity that we had last night. Over the weekend, possibly on Sunday night, it'll be clear tomorrow.
Right, Jeff Bateman, thank you very much. And from there we go from Ottery St Mary back to the studio.
Thanks, David. A few miles to the north of Ottery St Mary, there's been an outbreak of sickness among 300 campers hit by the flooding. Altogether, more than 1,000 people had to be evacuated after a river burst its banks and flooded the area. Julia Pete has the story.
For campers at Escott House, this was the morning after the night before. The Campers Arts Festival had been swamped in just a couple of hours.
We'd been there thinking we're going to have a dry couple of days and have a nice end to campus, and then, what was it, tea time? We just sat in the tent watching it rise here, and then suddenly decided we better do something about it.
Hundreds were forced to flee, taking shelter beneath the big top.
Yeah, they had to take everything out of the car.
The water level in places was coming up to 5 feet in people's tents. Cars were submerged. We've got cars washed against the fence at the bottom of the south camping field. People's possessions were floating away.
It was scary. We were very worried about children. Everyone was. You know, and there's a lot of people sick this morning.
For those feeling the ill effects, help was at hand.
Approximately 300 people, a lot of them younger, suffering from diarrhoea and vomiting. Those people were set aside and were basically monitored, given fluids, combat dehydration.
Today, health officials were investigating after several campers were taken to hospital.
We don't really know its source yet, but we've done everything possible to contain it, and it's not actually a serious problem to us.
Packed up and heading home, for many it was an early end to their summer holiday.
And tonight, just one flood warning remains in place. It's a yellow warning for the River Clyst in East Devon.